Have you ever wondered why ancient wisdom keepers guarded their most profound insights so carefully, refusing to share them openly with the masses? Well, what if I told you that scattered across different traditions, from Christ's mountaintop teachings to forgotten gospels to modern spiritual science, lies a blueprint for human transformation that most people may never discover? Well, these teachings weren't hidden to keep you ignorant, but possibly to protect you from attempting something that you weren't ready for, that mankind wasn't ready for, maybe until now. But today we're going to explore three revolutionary texts, in my view, that reveal how extraordinary things can be accessible to ordinary people through states of consciousness and spiritual exploration that may just help you discover some spiritual gifts and maybe who you really are. I'm Mark Roach. Welcome to Transcendent, my platform to help you be yourself, authentic. And if you like, define your uniqueness and your essence. Now beware, my perspective may be uncomfortable. It was formed from a twisted journey around the world, crossing a wide spectrum of experiences. It began in the Ozarks in Missouri, and it's been all over the world through highs and lows, at least as most people define them. This channel is all about inspiring common people to find their power and place their uniqueness in their lives. My life has been a research lab. I've studied mystics and healers, started a couple of oil companies, walked away from a path to the NFL when I realized that I couldn't conform to materialistic and, in some views, violent lifestyles or dominant lifestyles. I've raised well over $1 billion for startups. I've been in the middle of $10 billion of transactions. I found myself leading, as I look back, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 professionals in geology and engineering professionals around the world. I've been mentored in business and athletics by rich and famous characters who you've heard of and know. I've been mentored by Hollywood coaches, artists, and directors. I'm a longtime student and practitioner in theater and film. Studied acting, Meisner, that approach being the most notable pathway that worked well for me, that I found satisfaction and connection in. I'm a writer, I'm a journaler, I'm a filmmaker, producer, actor, director, and I've read and chronicled thousands of psychology textbooks and publications. I've studied hundreds, if not thousands, of people in my life. And I've tested the theories that I've read and researched, discovered, stumbled into in the reality of my own life. So in what you might see and label as experiments, I try to bring that out here through stories and ways that I can relate this to you. And so you may want to label me as a mystic or a longstanding observer of life, a researcher of not only mankind, but I'm also a student of the earth and just my simple fellow man. And so here, why in this medium? Well, I'm here to try to ease the way for others who may deal with some of the questions that I've dealt with in my own life, some of the longings, the searchings, the curiosity. Sometimes we're labeled with complex PTSD, or there's an incident that causes doubt in maybe some kind of normal thinking or program that you felt like failed you and didn't really quite meet your expectations. So some of us may have been labeled as having complex PTSD, or maybe having a calling, or just being an artist and wanting to pursue your uniqueness. Or maybe you have a friend that you're trying to understand, or a loved one that's in a difficult place. Well, what I share on this channel and what I'm about to share here in this video, this comes from three extraordinary, what I consider extraordinary sources that many people have never really encountered, maybe in the way that I'm going to present them here and in their complete form. Well, the first is from a fellow named Rudolf Steiner. It's a lecture that he made back in 1924 on gaining knowledge of supersensible worlds. He delivered this in Paris. Now, Steiner was an Austrian philosopher and mystic. Some people call him an esoteric Christian who looked deeper beneath maybe the superficial elements that were presented about Christ in the Bible. And he founded what some people call spiritual science. Now, the second text is the complete Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew. And that contains some of the most radical spiritual instructions that have ever been delivered. And the third text I'm going to mention here is the Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of 114 secret sayings. They're not so much secret now that they've been discovered and published, but those 114 sayings attributed to Jesus that were stashed away, preserved, or hidden from the collective, from the general population for hundreds of years, and they weren't included in the traditional Bible. Now, those three texts, when understood together or viewed together, reveal something rather remarkable about each of our spirits, our spiritual connections, our spiritual lives, that perhaps is more real today because we've grown, we've evolved beyond the physical and the mental that were so dominant 2,000 years ago. Today we're on the brink of escaping the mental prisons that pour ego and pour these old survival strategies into our lifestyles. And with the transparency that we're afforded today through social media, film and media, and the repetition that goes on in our society, we're beginning to see these patterns that we're living by and how we're identifying with them and attributing things that may or may not be true to them. But the path of inner development transforms ordinary human consciousness into something far greater. And that was something that was very accessible to the mystics of old. And I believe that Jesus was bringing as a messenger to mankind. Now, here's what most people miss. These aren't just philosophical ideas or like religious concepts that are taught in a classroom and then you walk away and live a different kind of life. These are practical instructions and possibilities for developing abilities that most people don't even know that are possible, and that actually we all possess. So let's start with Rudolf Steiner's revolutionary insight about human consciousness. In this 1924 lecture, Steiner explained that ordinary thinking is the only aspect of our inner life that remains independent of a healthy physical body. He said only thinking is, if it is healthy, independent of our physicality. If we're able to devote ourselves fully and inwardly to the character of thinking, we will find that this thinking can only supply us with independent logical laws. Now think about what this means. Steiner is saying your thoughts aren't produced by your brain the way most scientists claim. When your thinking is clear and healthy, it operates independently of your physical body. Now, this isn't New Age or wishful thinking. Steiner was describing something that you can verify for yourself through direct experience. And I can tell you by examining my own thoughts and my journals for over 40 years that I've kept, that ideas run through my head that I've examined, and for one reason or another, I never acted upon. But I did allow and accepted and observed those thoughts again and again without identifying with many of those thoughts and ideas. And you may have heard others say or suggest not to believe everything that runs through your head. And my own view is the mind is not the director of your life. It's a much better observer and a very helpful co-pilot in many respects. But there's another problem with thinking that Steiner points out, because some people simply stop thinking and just repeat patterns without observing. Their minds can be lazy and passive. They can become dependent on external stimulation or become mindless followers and minions to dictators, to externals, to idols, to people they worship or follow. And they get fooled into thinking that they're being active when they're actually passive. We can become mental consumers, like armchair quarterbacks, maybe sometimes thinking that we're in a game when we're actually just passively participating in our minds. Our spirits suffer from the absence of real connection. And physically, we can become dormant. We turn off all of our faculties to an entrained worship of those who appear to be active, or celebrities, or people that are entitled, when we put ourselves into this dormant, hypnotized, maybe victimized state of being, rather than living our own lives, filling our lives with spirit and true activity, and being present as creators with God and our fellow man, using our mind as a co-pilot and as a record keeper. Now, Steiner observed that modern people actually place great importance on retaining this passivity of thinking, rather than, since they fear that if they shape their own thoughts and arbitrarily out of themselves, they will find themselves in an imaginary realm. This fear of active thinking keeps us trapped in ordinary consciousness. Now, I believe that this is where AI may be able to help. Our egos claims thoughts as their own. When we begin to learn, we are simply repeating old patterns, and our ego gets engaged. And then we identify, and we get blindsided and stuck in these old repetitive patterns and behaviors. They're not courageous and they're not creative, but they get defended with a survival level intensity of our emotions. But they're typically a false causality. That is, if they're examined, they do not hold any truth. They are not universally true. We don't even know why we believe what we believe. And if you examine one bubble on Earth or one community and compare it to another community, you see rule systems in one that are totally different than those in another. And, for example, in Africa, someone with a large belly may be looked up upon as a wonderful provider of food and resources, whereas someone with a large belly in maybe the United States or Europe may be looked upon as a glutton. Well, is there a truth about either the belly from either one of these perspectives? I'll leave that up to you to examine. Now, the good news is that transparency is beginning to expose the foolishness of our sacred cows, of the idols that we make, of the celebrities that we worship or hold to be higher than ourselves, our institutions that we revere that may have failed some of us. that because of these blind spots in collective humanity, we may not even see the obvious things in front of our own faces. We may not, for example, believe that, our cars are maybe giving off pollution. Yet when we close ourselves off in the garage, they threaten our lives when we breathe their fumes. So many of us may have gotten out of touch or have forgotten how to feel the honor of being alive and in touch with our own senses and our own spirits and the access to the truth that really surround us. So now I'm just suggesting that we're seeing AI can take over some of these patterns and maybe some of the false pride that we have in our memories of reciting passages from books or other resources become exposed for just being dogmatic or robotic, whereas they're not necessarily intelligent or creative. The mind is being cloned. The Industrial Revolution cloned our physicality and gave us access to strength or to be the master over the machine that could multiply our productivity manyfold. So the pride and identity once ascribed to someone who could pick up a barrel of oil or of whatever is not really all that respected today, whereas it was at one point revered. So note that your body operates on autopilot. Most of your critical functions physically and your health system operate well beyond your deliberate thinking, like your nervous system, your heartbeat, your breathing. Your emotions may be affected by some of your thinking and feeling, but how much control do you really have over those moods that you feel? Even your fears and your wants, your desires, often operate without your deliberation. So now we're seeing AI can take over the conformed survival patterns that have been mistakenly ascribed to God or the universe or some creative authority or entity that's bigger than ourselves, or even more commonly, have even superseded, may have even superseded your confidence in yourself. So AI may just be a great tool for mastery, for helping you observe. And with work, it may help you separate your spirit from the lies that may be operating and driving the world. AI could become an agency of freedom, something to help with exposing how things are really working and become an evolutionary tool. So I believe that we're so afraid of being deluded that we never develop some of our inner capacities that could show us reality beyond the physical world. But what if there was a way to strengthen your thinking the same way that you strengthen your muscles through exercise? Or not necessarily your thinking, but your access to spirit. Steiner described a method he called meditation, but unlike anything most people associate with the word, he explained, in dwelling actively with our whole soul upon an inner content, something happens with our soul faculties that otherwise occurs in the physical body. If, say, we kept using a particular set of muscles to accomplish a specific kind of work, the muscles strengthen. In the same way, our powers of soul strengthen inwardly if the soul's activity is repeatedly focused upon a particular content. This isn't about emptying your mind or achieving some blissful state. It's about consciously strengthening your capacity for focused attention. You take a simple thought or image and hold it at the center of your consciousness with complete intentionality. Over time, this practice transforms the very nature of your thinking. Here's where it gets interesting. The Gospel of Thomas begins with a similar promise. The very first saying states, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." This isn't talking about physical immortality, in my view. It's describing a state of consciousness that transcends the ordinary fear of death because you're discovering something within yourself that was never born and therefore can never die. The third saying in the Gospel of Thomas provides a crucial key. If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It's in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. Notice the emphasis on self-knowledge. This isn't about believing in external authorities or following a religious dogma. It's about discovering something within your own consciousness that connects you directly to what the text calls the living Father. But how do you achieve this self-knowledge? The Gospel of Thomas provides another clue in saying number 70. That which you have will save you if you bring it forth from yourselves. That which you do not have within you will kill you if you do not have it within you. You already possess what you need for this transformation, but it remains dormant until you actively develop it. This connects directly to Jesus' teachings and Sermon on the Mount. But most people completely misunderstand what he was actually saying. When Jesus declared, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," he wasn't promoting some kind of spiritual poverty. He was describing the first step of the process of inner development. Being poor in spirit means recognizing that your ordinary ego consciousness is inadequate for perceiving higher reality. It's the humility to admit that everything you think that you know about yourself and the world might be incomplete. This isn't self-depreciation. It's the beginning of wisdom. Even neuroscience today is confirming that we probably are just aware of around 5% of everything that is really happening around us. But Jesus continued, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Is he talking about being a martyr or feeling bad about things? Well, what are we mourning? Well, we're mourning what Jesus was pointing to is mourning the loss of illusions about who we thought we were. So when you begin serious inner work, you discover that most of our identity is constructed from social conditioning, unconscious reactions, and borrowed ideas. So there's some mourning involved in letting that go. It doesn't happen overnight and it's not easy. And it may not happen for many of us in an entire lifetime. But for a few of us who have been hit by tragedy and for whatever reason have found our curiosity carries us into some of those places where we examine identity in these patterns that are around us. And the mourning can help you recognize how much of your life has been lived from a false sense of self. And it's scary walking into that abyss. But I'm here to tell you, there is some comfort there. And as you realize that there are these illusions that many people are living by, you then begin to discover your authentic nature. And that's what Jesus meant when he said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Meekness isn't weakness. The strength that comes from no longer needing to defend a false identity is incredible. The Sermon on the Mount is actually a complete instruction manual for spiritual development, but it's written in a code that most people just don't decipher easily. When Jesus said, "You're the light of the world," he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing a literal capacity that develops through this inner work. And Steiner explained what happens when you seriously practice the kind of concentrated thinking he described. He says our thinking will gradually be entirely transformed. It will shed all abstraction, all coldness. Thinking becomes very pictorial. We gain the ability to think in images that are rich and vivid, even full of color. This is the first stage of what Steiner called imaginative knowledge. Your thinking becomes alive with images that aren't products of fantasy, but perceptions of reality beyond the physical world. You begin to see patterns and connections that were always there, but invisible to ordinary consciousness. But this, it's just the beginning. As you continue to develop these capacities, something even more remarkable happens. Steiner goes on to describe the next stage. He says that if we desire to progress further, we must add a third capacity of perception, one that the modern mind may, very rarely regards as a faculty of knowledge. This capacity does play the greatest conceivable role in human life. I'm speaking of the human power of love. Most people think of love as an emotion. Steiner was ascribing love as a spiritual organ of perception. When you develop love beyond ordinary emotional expression, it becomes a way of knowing reality from the inside. You don't just observe spiritual beings and forces, you can actually commune with them. This connects to one of the most profound sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, "I myself will become he, and what is hidden will be revealed to him." This isn't about worshiping Jesus as an external savior. It's about developing the same consciousness that Jesus embodied. You become what he called the Christ consciousness. The Gospel of Thomas makes this even more explicit in saying 13. When the disciples ask Jesus who he is like, Thomas responds, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." And Jesus replies, "I am not your master, because you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring of which I have measured out." Thomas isn't being honored for his ignorance. He's being recognized for having reached a state of consciousness where he can no longer see Jesus as separate from himself. They've both drunk from the same source of spiritual wisdom. This is why the gospel is attributed to Thomas, whose name means twin. He became the twin of Christ consciousness. This is how, you may ask, how does this practical development actually work in daily life? Well, the Sermon on the Mount provides specific instructions that most people interpret as impossible moral demands. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you," he wasn't asking you to manufacture fake or artificial feelings of affection for people that were hurting you, possibly. He was describing a natural result of expanded consciousness. When you begin to perceive reality through what Steiner called inspired knowledge, you recognize that what appears as enemies and persecutions are actually opportunities for developing higher capacities. The person who seems to be attacking you is unconsciously providing you with exactly the resistance you need to strengthen your spiritual muscles. This is why Jesus said, "Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven." He wasn't promoting masochism, and he wasn't saying just endure this and then die and go to heaven. He was pointing out that opposition from unconscious people is actually confirming that you're developing something that they don't and can't understand. The Gospel of Thomas expresses the same principle in saying number 16. Men think, perhaps, that it is peace that I have come to cast upon the world. They do not know that it is dissension which I have come to cast upon the earth. Fire, sword, and war. The fire, sword, and war aren't external conflicts. These aren't literal events, but they represent the inner struggle between your expanding consciousness and the parts of yourself that resist change. As you develop these higher capacities, your ordinary personality goes through a kind of death and rebirth. This is what all genuine spiritual traditions have always taught, but most people try to avoid this transformation because it's uncomfortable, it's not popular, and they want the benefits of spiritual development without the challenge of actually changing. Now, Steiner was very clear about what this process involves. Just as we laid aside our physical and etheric body in the cultivation of higher knowledge, so we can recognize that now that at death, we merely lay aside the physical and etheric body, and that we then pass through the gate of death into a world of spirit. You don't have to wait until physical death to experience this. Through systemic inner development, you can learn to step outside your ordinary identification with your body and personality while still living. You discover that your essential nature is something far greater than what you normally consider yourself to be. This brings us to one of the most revolutionary aspects of these teachings. They all point toward the same understanding. You're not who you think you are. Your true identity is what the Gospel of Thomas calls the living one, what Jesus called the Son of the living Father, and what Steiner described as the eternal I that passes from one earthly life to another. The Gospel of Thomas, saying number 11, expresses this beautifully. Quote, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away. The dead are not alive, and the living will not die. In the days when you ate what is dead, you made it alive. When you are in the light, what will you do?" End quote. So everything you normally think of as solid and permanent, including your physical body and personality, is actually temporary. But there's something within you that was never born and can never die. When you discover this through direct experience rather than belief, your entire relationship to life transforms. You no longer live from fear because you've discovered that what you really are cannot be threatened. You no longer chase external validation because you've found an internal source of value that doesn't depend on other people's opinion. You no longer feel separate from others because you've recognized the same essential nature in everyone. This is what Jesus meant when he said in the Sermon on the Mount, quote, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect," end quote. This isn't a moral command that's impossible to fulfill, like many ministers and Christians might feel and say behind the scenes as they kind of avoid addressing that statement. It's a description of what naturally happens when you develop beyond ordinary ego consciousness. You begin to embody the same qualities that people have always attributed to the divine. But here's the crucial point that most people miss. None of this happens automatically. It requires systemic practice and often years of dedicated inner work. The ancient mystery schools that Steiner described understood this well. They didn't give people spiritual experiences through external methods like drugs or extreme rituals. They taught methods that people could practice independently to develop their own inner capacities. Steiner explained why this individual approach is essential for modern people. Quote, "People today would have no trust or confidence in anyone who had to seek a path to the spiritual world by external means. And this is because these methods require strict seclusion of the spiritual seeker from the world. In ancient times, trust was only invested in spiritual people if they secluded themselves from the rest of humanity. Whereas today, we only trust seekers if they stand fully in life. You can't retreat from the world to develop spiritually. You have to find ways to transform your consciousness while remaining engaged with ordinary life. This is actually more challenging than the old approach, but it produces more stable and practical results. The method I'm describing, well, they aren't theoretical. They're practices that you can begin immediately. Start with meditation, a technique that Steiner outlined. Take a simple phrase or image that you hold at the center of your attention for maybe 10 or 15 minutes daily. Don't let your mind wander. Keep your attention back on this chosen focus with gentle but firm intention. At first, this will seem impossible. Your mind will resist it like a wild horse being trained. But gradually, you'll notice that your capacity for sustained attention strengthens. Your thinking becomes clearer and more independent of external stimulation. You begin to experience moments of what Steiner called imaginative perception. Combine this with practical instructions from the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus said, "When you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." He was teaching you to act from your deeper nature rather than your ego's need for recognition. Practice anonymous kindness. Help people without them knowing who helped them. When he said, "When you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray for your Father who is in secret," he was teaching you to develop a direct relationship with the source of your being rather than depending on external religious authorities. Spend time in silence, not asking for things, but simply opening yourself to whatever wisdom wants to emerge. The Gospel of Thomas provides another practical key in saying 42, become passerby. Don't get trapped in the drama of ordinary life. Remain engaged but not attached. Move through experiences without being defined by them. This doesn't mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means maintaining perspective on what's truly important. As you practice these methods consistently, you'll begin to notice changes. Your reactions to difficult people and situations become less automatic. You find yourself responding from a deeper place of wisdom rather than just reacting to old patterns. You start to have moments of expanded awareness where you perceive connections and meanings that weren't visible to you before. You might also notice that your dreams become more vivid and meaningful. This is because the same consciousness you're developing during waking hours continues working while you sleep. You're beginning to access what Steiner called the etheric body, the aspect of yourself that maintains the patterns of your life experiences. Some people develop what seems like psychic abilities. You might know things that you couldn't know through ordinary means, or sense things about people that prove to be accurate. But these are side effects, not the main goal. The real purpose is developing what the Gospel of Thomas calls gnosis, direct knowledge of your essential nature. Saying number 3 of the Gospel of Thomas warns against getting distracted by external phenomenon. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known. You will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. So self-knowledge isn't learning facts about your personality or your psychological history. It's discovering the observer behind all of your experiences. Who is aware of your thoughts? Who experiences your emotions? Who remains present through all the changes of your life? This constant awareness is what these teachings point toward. The Sermon on the Mount describes the qualities that naturally emerge as this self-knowledge develops. You become merciful because you understand that everyone is struggling with their own unconsciousness. You become a peacemaker because you're no longer driven by internal conflict. You become pure in heart because you're no longer divided against yourself. Jesus promised, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." This isn't about a moral purity in the conventional sense. It's about a unified consciousness. When your attention is no longer scattered by competing desires and fears, you begin to perceive the divine presence that was always there, but perhaps hidden by inner noise. This is what Steiner meant when he described the goal of modern spiritual development. If we have true intentions toward the world of spirit, we will behold the human will for new mysteries that is quite assuredly coming to birth. For spirituality will only return to humankind if new mysteries arise in which people can discover the spirit in a more conscious way. The mystery schools of the ancient world were destroyed, but the need for spiritual development hasn't disappeared. It's actually more urgent now than ever. We live in a time when external technology has advanced incredibly while inner development has been neglected. This creates dangerous imbalances. People have tremendous power to manipulate the physical world, but lack the wisdom to use that power responsibly. We can communicate instantly with anyone on the planet, but we've lost touch with our own souls. We can access infinite information, but have difficulty distinguishing truth from deception. The teachings I've shared today offer a solution, but only for those willing to do the inner work required. You can't just read about these ideas or believe in them intellectually. You have to practice them consistently over time. Most people aren't willing to make this commitment because it requires changing how they live. The Gospel of Thomas is very clear about this challenge, saying 75 states, "Many are standing at the door, but it is the solitary who will enter the bridal chamber." Well, the bridal chamber represents the physical or mystical union between your ordinary consciousness and your higher nature. It's a metaphor, but you can only enter it alone, meaning you can't depend on anyone else to do this work for you. This doesn't mean you have to become a hermit. It means taking responsibility for your own spiritual development rather than waiting for someone else to save you or enlighten you. The path is individual, but the goal is universal. As you develop these capacities, you naturally want to help others discover the same possibilities. This is why Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, and you're the light of the world." When you embody these higher qualities, you become a catalyst for awakening, for experiencing a more full life for yourself and for others. It's no longer an outdated viewpoint of pushing or dominating or speaking down to others. Love levels the playing field to one of common understanding and appreciation. You no longer feel the pull to tell or to preach or to teach because you recognize that others are exactly where they were or are today for a greater purpose. You don't need to rearrange what's before you. Your very presence begins to remind people of their own deeper nature. Steiner described this as the real purpose of spiritual development. Knowledge is needed for our thinking, feeling, and will so as to gain inward clarity and live harmoniously, and thus also find strength and security in outward life. You don't develop these capacities to escape from ordinary life. You develop them to engage with life more effectively and compassionately. The ultimate promise of these teachings is that you can discover who you really are beneath all the roles and identities you've assumed. You can access states of consciousness that reveal the spiritual dimensions of reality. You can develop love that transcends personal preference and wisdom that transcends cultural conditioning. But you have to start with where you are, with what you have today, in the now. Take the meditation practice that I described, maybe commit to it for at least 30 days. Begin practicing the principles from the Sermon on the Mount in your daily interactions. Study the Gospel of Thomas with the understanding that each saying is pointing toward direct experience rather than intellectual understanding. Don't expect dramatic results immediately. These are subtle processes that unfold gradually. But if you persist with sincere intention, you'll begin to notice changes that confirm you're moving in the right direction. Your inner life will become richer and more meaningful. Your relationships will improve because you're relating from a deeper level of yourself. Your work will become more fulfilling because you'll understand how it serves your overall development. It's not to say there won't be challenges. More importantly, you'll begin to experience what Steiner called certainty of immortality, not as a belief or a hope, but as direct knowledge based on your own experience of consciousness, independent of physical conditions. You'll discover that death is simply another transition in an ongoing journey of development that extends far beyond this single lifetime. The Gospel of Thomas expresses this beautifully in saying 18. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us how our end will be." And Jesus said, "Have you discovered then the beginning that you look for the end? For where the beginning is, there will the end be. So blessed is he who will take his place in the beginning. He will know the end and will not experience death." Your true beginning isn't your physical birth. It's the eternal moment of awareness that has always been present, but usually overlooked. When you discover this beginning through the practices that I've described and others, you understand that what you really are has no end. Death becomes as natural and unthreatening as sleep. This knowledge transforms everything. You no longer live from fear of loss because you've discovered what cannot be lost. You no longer seek happiness in external circumstances because you found a source of joy that doesn't depend on conditions. You no longer feel isolated because you've recognized your essential connection to all life. These aren't just beautiful ideas, they're practical realities available to anyone willing to undertake the journey of inner development. Now be patient with yourself. It takes more than just thinking about these powerful aspects for them to become accessible to your being. That's why people scoff or say this is woo-woo or wishful, because it takes some dedication and it's not for everyone. Willpower and perseverance, some love and trust, and certainly faith. Perhaps most importantly, the hand of God to transcend the patterned attitudes that have been handed down through the ages. These three texts that we've explored today provide contemporary perspectives on the same fundamental process that Steiner outlined in 1924. Gives you some systemic methods. The Sermon on the Mount shows you how to embody the results in daily life. The Gospel of Thomas points you toward the ultimate realization of your divine nature. So the choice is yours. You can continue living from the assumption that you're nothing more than a temporary physical organism struggling to survive in a meaningless universe. Or you can begin an adventure of discovering who you really are, what you're capable of becoming. The door is always open, but only you can walk through it. I'm Mark Roach, and this is Transcendent, wishing you all the best.